Hello, good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever in the world you might be joining us from. My name is Tania Karas. I'm a senior editor at Devex, and welcome to Devex at COP26. In the lead up to this momentous event, there have been several reports on the rise of climate change already and what we're going to see in the coming decades. The rise of climate displacement comes with it. This is particularly true in lower income countries that tend to be the most climate vulnerable and often the least equipped to respond to these changing migration patterns. I'm joined here by a group of excellent panelists who are all experts in the area of displacement and climate change. So let's get started. Um, our first panelist is Dr. Kanta Kumari Rigaud. She is the lead environment specialist and a regional climate change coordinator of the Africa region at the World Bank. Um, Kanta, you were behind two pretty momentous reports recently called the Groundswell reports, one in 2018 and one this year, an updated version that focused on internal migration. Um, your report this year warned that unchecked climate change could lead to 216 million people to migrate within their own countries by 2050. And of course, that's just internal migration. So I wondered if you could tell us a little bit about why this focus on internal migration and whether that's really going to be what the world should be the most prepared to see in the coming years and decades.
Thank you, Tanya. It's a pleasure to be here. And that's a great question. Why did we focus on internal climate migration? We know that migration, happens across the borders, it happens regionally, and it certainly happens within countries. Our focus on internal climate migration was driven by the data out there that says 3 out of 4 people actually move within their own countries. And that's not to say that other movement is not important, but we wanted to focus on this with a view to really understanding what are really the drivers of migration at at the local level. We know that a lot of this movement starts somewhere and at the localities that it does. So this really, brought us to looking at the issues at the nexus of where climate, migration, and development come together at the local level. So using the two reports, the Groundswell Acting for Internal Climate Migration, which we launched recently, as well as Groundswell Preparing for Internal Migration 3 years ago. Through the two reports, we were really able to reaffirm the potency for climate to drive the movement within countries. Particularly, we focus on the slow onsets, which is looking at water stress, drops in crop productivity, and sea level rise compounded by storm surge, which can really oftentimes undermine the habitability of those areas. And that global number that you referred to, the 216 million, comes out of a focus of the 6 World Bank regions. In the first report, we looked at Sub Saharan Africa, South Asia, and Latin America. In the sequel report, we looked at East Asia, we looked at Eastern Europe and Central Asia, and we looked at North Africa. We also did look at other regions qualitatively, which is the Mashrek region and the small island developing states.
Thank you so much. And we'll definitely come back to this report later in the conversation too. Next, I'd like to turn to Kaylee Ober. She is a senior advocate and program manager of the Climate Displacement Program at Refugees International. Kaylee, we just heard from Kanta about internal migration. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about cross-border displacement as well, because of course we're going to see a huge rise in that too. And so, could you tell us a little bit about the current legal framework for that, and really like a lack of a good legal framework for how to deal with cross-border migrants who are being displaced because of climate change?
Sure. First, I'd like to say that I agree with Kanta's assessment that most of the movement we'll see in the face of climate change will be internal in nature. Although, crossing over borders brings with it different additional challenges. And that's why this conversation about cross border protection is so important. There's one way of looking at cross-border protection, and that's international protection, or the 1951 Refugee Convention, which I think you're referring to, and which most people at home and those in the media care most about, because it's a strong international framework, and it's binding, and many states have signed on to it, including the United States. The reason why the term climate refugee is not applicable or is not useful in the context of this convention is for a very simple reason. The Refugee Convention lays out very specifically and defines who a refugee is, and nowhere in it does it talk about climate change or environmental change. Um, and with climate change, it adds additional layers of difficulty in understanding attribution, like to what degree does climate change really induce such movements? Aside from the legal question, which is where does climate change feature in the convention? Fortunately, there's brilliant legal minds thinking about this, including the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR, who released in October, in fact, a new legal considerations paper that really takes into account the context of climate change and disaster within the Refugee Convention and regional refugee definitions, such as the Cartagena Declaration or the OAU Convention. And it finds that in certain cases, the convention may be applicable to folks who are displaced in the context of climate change. For instance, if you suffer from a climate disaster and your government purposely does not provide relief and recovery for you because of your status within a social group, that may mean that you've been persecuted or it's tantamount to persecution. And so, therefore, that international protection can be possibly extended to you. Likewise, these regional refugee definitions are much more expansive than the 1951 Refugee Convention. So, in the Cartagena Declaration and the OAU Convention, they really talk about disturbance of public order, which is a much broader aspect that people are starting to believe can cover climate change and displacement issues. So, those are things that are really on the forefront that we're interested in diving into a little bit deeper.
Yeah, definitely. That's fascinating. And I'm sure that, these are areas of international law that will only become more and more important with the rise of, more climate displacement. So, of course, I have many, many more questions for you as well. But let's get to our last panelist, too. Zeke Simperingham. He's the global lead of migration and displacement for the IFRC. Zeke, you work a lot in conflict and disaster settings. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how IFRC's work is shifting and changing as more and more people are displaced for climate reasons.
Thanks, Tanya, and of course, thank you very much for the invitation to be here. I think for us, the first thing to recognize is that this is a critical humanitarian issue. It's creating devastating impacts on individuals, on communities across the world, but it's also a very diverse humanitarian issue. There is no one type of climate-related displacement. There is no one type of climate displaced person. So for us, a lot of our work is focused on action, but also enhancing our understanding of this issue. And so we have recently released a new global report that looks at what are the impacts of climate-related displacement on communities across the world today. And it looks at 11 different contexts, and they are deliberately diverse contexts where communities are already facing the humanitarian impacts of climate-related displacement. We have examples of, as you have mentioned, internal displacement, but also cross-border displacement. And for example, one of the contexts we look at is the humanitarian needs of communities who fled drought in Angola and they crossed the border into Namibia. We also look at the impact on communities who fled climate-related impacts and then joined migration caravans in the Central Americas. But we also, of course, look at a lot of contexts where people are displaced within their own countries by a diverse range of hazards and climate features, from sea level rise to storms to floods to landslides. Another thing that we are looking at in terms of better understanding how we can support communities is where these impacts are compounding or concurrent, where we see storms hitting the same communities within the space of a few weeks or even months, and where we see compound impacts, not only from the COVID-19 pandemic and its related impacts on communities and how that intersects with climate, but also, as you mentioned, where we see communities affected by conflict who are now also being impacted by climate-related impacts. So we see a lot of critical humanitarian needs, but we also see a lot of diversity. And so as there is no one type of climate displaced person, there is no one type of solutions. So some of the things we really are focusing on is community-led solutions, Tania. We really need to better understand what are the impacts at the community level, what are the solutions that communities themselves can bring to this issue, and how can we as a global humanitarian network take that to scale across the world.
That sounds like a really fascinating report. And yeah, solutions seems like a very tricky thing to find in this context, certainly. I'd love to talk about solutions with all of you, actually. Um, Perhaps we could start with Kanta. Um, what do you think are some of the from the groundswell report? Can you tell us some of your recommendations for governments? Yeah, I'd like to know if some of the recommendations that you had for governments and what obligations they have for their own citizens who might be internally displaced.
Indeed, I think the problems are plentiful, and I think the reality is, as you know, Tanya, in the sixth IPCC Science Assessment Report, the forecast or the future is even more daunting, right? So I think the reality is that we must now begin to prepare for this with even greater escalation of efforts. So in the Groundswell report, we really underscore three key policy issues. The first is, I think, and critically important, we must cut down greenhouse gas emissions. Without that, I think the kind of impacts that we are looking at will multiply and will escalate, whether it's impacts on crop productivity, whether it's the sea level rise, or whether it's the kind of water stress or the uncertainty of when the seasonality patterns shifting. So it's really important that we cut down the greenhouse gases. And in the report, what we did was a scenario-based analysis that also allowed us to look at a plausible scenario where if we did a few things right, we could really reduce the scale of climate-induced migration. So the first is, as I said, cut down the greenhouse gases. The second is, how do we really bring and embed migration into the context of development planning? And I speak especially from the context of a development institution. And there are things that we can begin to do and are doing, but we need to all step up on that. And that is really recognizing that we need to better help communities, to the point that Ezekiel was making, adapt in place, right? Better adapt in place, whether it's coming up with crops that are drought resilient, or whether we have the water availability, taken care of. But also looking at diversification of economic opportunities and livelihoods. So adapting in place is really important. But there will come a time when there are situations where one has to move. And in that context, how do you facilitate that movement in a way that is safe and dignified, in line with the kind of conventions and legal provisions that exist, and also those within the country? So that becomes really important. And the third is, after communities have had to move, what is it that we can do to make sure there's greater social cohesion between the hosts and the migrants? And as I speak, Tanya, I mean, this could be sort of things we're doing now. But one of the things about the Groundswell report is that we really call for looking at things across the time horizon. We found in the report, beyond the number that is big or small, one can argue about it, is the spatial dimension, because locality really matters. What we find is that between now and as early as 2030, you could see the emergence of climate migration hotspots. These are hotspots where people could move into because they're relatively more attractive, or move out from. And it is that movement that one needs to sort of look and plan towards, because what you want is, where movement needs to happen, it should happen. But in other cases, how do we bring in the best kind of development options to make sure that, or even humanitarian, to make sure that that movement happens in a safe and dignified way and in a productive way. So there are lots of solutions out there, lots of projects that we can come back and talk about, which are beginning to do this, but it's about doing it at scale that I think is really what we need to push for.
Definitely. That's really fascinating, Kanta. Thank you for sharing that. And you talked about really preparing, and I think that that is maybe something that is just dawning on a lot of governments, especially this year. Well, with the pandemic too, and especially this year with the rise of so many natural disasters. Just really this like need and realization, this slow realization that all of you folks on this call have been talking about for years and years and years, but is really just becoming, a lot more mainstream, and hopefully we'll see some action from that. Was there anyone else who wanted to talk about solutions that that you have been studying in regard to the rise of climate-induced displacement?
I'm happy to jump in there, Tanya, if it's okay, and very much complement a lot of what Kanta has mentioned, and also picking up on your point around preparedness. A lot of what we do as a humanitarian network, a lot of what we do as the Red Cross and Red Crescent is humanitarian response. And I had a look today, and Tanya, we have an active 91 emergency humanitarian response operations across the globe today. The vast majority of them are connected to weather and climate related hazards, and the majority of them have people, individuals, communities who have been displaced by the effects of those hazards. So that's a very visible part of what we do as humanitarians. But picking up on what Kanta has said, and also your point about preparedness, when we look at climate-related displacement, a very critical opportunity we have is that we don't have to wait until people are displaced. We can and we should and we must act now. Again, going back to my original point, recognizing the diversity of this issue, that's going to look very different in different contexts. That adaptation, that resilience is going to be distinct across the globe. So we need to recognize the local reality. We need to recognize the complexity of what that looks like. We also, as you mentioned at the start, Tanya, need to recognize that it's the most vulnerable, the people who are already marginalized, who are the most at risk from the humanitarian impacts of climate-related displacement. But we need to see these communities, we need to work with these communities not only as at risk and potentially vulnerable, but also having important capacities, and the communities themselves having important solutions and ways of adapting and ideas and knowledge that we need to harness as a globe, rather than seeing communities as passive victims in this issue.
Definitely. Yeah, and of course, the more that we can get people involved, I think people often know what is best for them. And so if they are given a voice, and given real power to be part of that change, that will hopefully lead to more sustainable solutions, for this growing problem. So definitely hope we see some more of that. Kaylee, I wondered if you could talk a little bit about, there was a really interesting report that Refugees International had earlier this summer, where you basically said that it was mostly about the United States. And the report said that the US has a special responsibility to lead on issues of climate change, migration, and displacement. Can you talk a little bit about why that is, both the United States in particular, but similar obligations that perhaps other richer countries have, and what should that special responsibility look like?
Thank you so much. So that report was called was put together by a task force of experts, former government officials from the State Department in USA, technical experts on the issue of climate change, migration, displacement, and heads of major NGOs. And so it was really a collaborative effort to point out ways in which the Biden administration, in particular, could grapple with this issue. In response to actually the Biden administration issuing an executive order in February 2021, requesting that the SC put together a report on this very issue. And so I think we make the case very clearly that the United States is a key player in this for many reasons. One, the US has absolutely a moral obligation to be interested and engaged with climate change and migration issues as the largest greenhouse gas emitter historically. I think, in addition, it just has a practical, logical responsibility as well as a country that has traditionally been the biggest donor towards humanitarian efforts as well as towards resettling a very high number of refugees historically in the past. So I think there is many reasons why the U.S. should be involved, but the Biden administration has also signaled it wants to be involved and become a leader on this issue. And in fact, just the other week, released this NSC report that I've referenced, in which it enumerates a number of ways that it could work on issues related to foreign assistance, international security, multilateral engagement, and protection and resettlement with in regards to climate change and migration issues. Unfortunately, the report didn't go into great detail about policy, and so we're looking forward to this newly created interagency working group that's supposed to be a follow-up to this report to really delve into that detail there. And I think it's hugely important the Biden administration continues to lead on this.
Definitely. And as you were talking, I was thinking about something that Kanta said earlier about development planning. And so I wondered if anyone wants to jump in here on what can that planning really look like? Like, how do we get different stakeholders involved to really plan for this reality, whether it's within borders and across borders?
I'd like to come back to that, Tanya. I think it's a very important and pertinent conversation to have. And following the Groundswell report, we put out the Groundswell Africa reports, and these reports, were looking at both West Africa and the Lake Victoria Basin, really have taken a more sort of granular analysis of how this climate-induced migration could play out within the context of those countries. So it uses an expanded model and just more granular analysis. But more than that, I think it provides, I believe, policymakers a basis for good dialogue and action. And your question about what does action really mean? And I think what we first of all want to underscore, I think, is that migration is not always a negative. It is an adaptation strategy, right? And it reminds me a little bit about the pastoralists in the Sahel. I see them as the sort of original climate adapters. They'd always moved, with the changing seasonality, with their livestock, looking for pastures and water that was more predictable. The dilemma now is how climate has thrown in, the uncertainty and the unreliability. And so even as they move, they are not able to find those resources. And then there's an increasing number of conflict with the sedentary farmers. And so we therefore have, like Kelly was saying, the moral obligation to support this community. So the question is how? And in the Groundswell Africa, we begin to sort of pull together what we call a migration and climate informed solutions framework. And this framework combines the need to act now, but also brings in the development planning. It has really five critical dimensions. The first is, I think, we continue to need to understand the issue better. It is unfolding, and we know that migration is multifaceted, and there are multiple reasons why people move. Social, environmental, political sometimes. But clearly now climate being the amplifying factor. But understanding that both in the current and historical context is important. But the second part of it is, while we can look at the situation in very small locales, which is important to support the communities, we also need to take a bigger picture vision of it. Because as I mentioned, that climate is acting across the landscapes, across the countries, and of course, even internationally, but talking about within the country, it's acting. And so as you see this mobility driven by climate factors from one locale to another, it's important to take a territorial and a bigger landscape approach so that you are able to manage the situation from climate in and out migration perspectives. But importantly, you can draw that into part of your economic and demographic transitions. In sub-Saharan Africa, when we look at the 30-year horizon, you have a population that's going to be doubling in this 30 years from 2020 to 2050. And that demographic itself, which is now 60 to 70% reliant on climate sensitive livelihoods, needs a transition driven by economic transition, driven by jobs that are more climate sensitive or climate smart. And that needs to happen at a planning level, building the right kind of human capital almost to make sure that, in the case of Africa, where I work a lot on, making sure we get these young people trained and able to transit into that new economy. But the fourth dimension that we look at is really calling on ourselves, the development community, the humanitarian community, and the security community coming together and working to the points that Ziki is making that are really important so that we don't act in silos, but we act in an end to end fashion. And the last part of that framework is about the legal side that Kaylee's been talking about. How do we bridge that legal provisions in the country? Many countries have signed on to some of these global processes and global frameworks, like the Global Framework for Climate Migration, but Global Compact for Climate Migration. But how do we domesticate them? In the Africa context, we have the Kampala Convention, which has been signed on again, but domesticating what that means at a national level. So we think that the planning within and across these 5 pillars really provides a way to think through the issues, plan for today, act for today, plan for tomorrow, and as part of the sort of taking the countries into that sustainable development pathways that are climate smart and climate resilient. Um, just thought I'll share that with you because I think it's a pragmatic way and it's not new. It's really pulling together threads that have existed, but providing countries and governments a way to act on it systematically.
Yeah, thank you so much. I think that that's a really helpful framework for thinking about what needs to be done. And I wondered, this could be a question for anyone on the call. Are there any examples, either at the country or regional level, that you think are really working in terms of how to think about climate migration and how to really prepare for it? Are there any initiatives that we can point to as inspiration?
Yeah, Tanya, in fact, the regional level is really leading the way in solutions, especially around cross border migration. So we see in different parts of the world, in different regions and subregions, this move towards freedom of movement. So we know that, like Kanta said, we can try to prevent migration as much as possible, either through interventions around climate change adaptation, disaster risk reduction, things of that nature. But people will still need to move. And in fact, it's an adaptation strategy. So, how do we facilitate that movement or ensure that that movement is safe and dignified, as Kanta said earlier? And I think it's important the freedom of mobility across borders, the ability to seek out shelter and safety across the border in certain situations is quite important. So you have something like the Intergovernmental Authority on Development, EGOT, which is a subregion of sub-Saharan Africa and parts of East and the Great Lakes in Southern Africa, which have put together this freedom of movement protocol that allows people in the face of disaster to cross borders legally and to seek out safety and shelter across borders within that region. And I think that is really the forefront. That's really the future of climate change related migration, especially across borders, to allow people to move freely.
Zeke, is there anything you wanted to add to that?
I think picking up on that point, but also Kant's point before, when we look at the development perspective, when we look at the longer term perspective, we see that people, as Kaylee and Kanta have mentioned a lot, is people move in a lot of different ways. And there's one aspect that we haven't spoken about, one very specific way in which communities are moving, and that is when they take the decision that the impacts of climate are such a great risk that they need to permanently leave their community as a community. We call this planned relocation. It's where a community decides that they need to move. That's the best and the safest way to adapt to the impacts of climate. This is a very specific type of movement. It's a complicated type of way in which a community would move. And I think picking up on the point before about timescale, there's two aspects that we really need to look at. One is that this is not just a shelter project. This is not just creating new houses and new shelters in a new location away from where a community is. This is really a community building project. This is really a community development project. And so in terms of the time scale, we really need supporting actors. We really need the community themselves to look at a long-term horizon on this. And we have examples of communities that have moved, and 10 years later, local Red Cross and Red Crescent societies have gone to check how is the community development process going, far beyond the construction of shelter, far beyond the construction of facilities. So I think that's a very particular type of movement that we're seeing connected to climate. It is complicated, but it's also something that we're seeing come up as an operational a reality for many communities. And on that particular aspect, Tania, as well, we see some good practices. We see legal and policy and regulatory frameworks being developed, particularly in the Pacific, connected to sea level rise, where communities are looking at the realities of the climate crisis and saying the best possible thing we can do is to leave where we're living as a community permanently.
Yeah, certainly that's a very drastic solution. And, you know, many other solutions involve allowing people to stay in place. But of course, that will require a lot of what we're hoping to see out of out of COP, which is multilateral cooperation that will reduce the effects of climate change going forward. That's actually all we have time for on this really fascinating and very complicated topic. I feel like there's so much more we could have gone into, but thank you so much to our expert panelists, and thank you so much to our audience. Remember, if you would like to learn more from Devex, you can follow us on Twitter, and of course, subscribe to our newsletters, Devex Newswire being the flagship daily newsletter. And thank you so much for joining us.